The sound of the slap silenced every voice in that room. 112 guests. Champagne glasses still raised mid-toast. Crystal chandeliers glittering above a table overflowing with imported delicacies. And every single person froze. The jazz quartet stopped playing. The laughter died. And in the center of it all, a pregnant woman stumbled sideways. Her hand flying to her cheek. Her other hand instinctively wrapping around her swollen belly as if to shield the life growing inside her from the monster standing in front of her. Her name was Serafina. The man who had just struck her, in front of everyone he had ever wanted to impress, was her husband, Maxim Kessler, his 38th birthday. His party, his house, or at least that's what he believed. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because what happened that night, what unraveled in the weeks that followed, is a story that will make you question everything you think you know about power, about love, and about who really holds the cards when the truth finally comes out. So settle in, because this story, it doesn't end the way Maxim thought it would. Not even close. Let me take you back to where it all began. Serafina Morel grew up in a small coastal town called Harrowcliff, the kind of place where the sea air tasted like salt and sadness, and the houses leaned against each other like tired old men. Her mother, Margot, had been a seamstress who worked 14-hour days hemming dresses for women who never bothered to learn her name. Her father had left when Serafina was 4, vanishing one Tuesday morning with nothing but a duffel bag and a note that read, "I'm sorry, I can't do this." Serafina never saw him again. But there was one person who made that small, struggling life feel enormous, her grandmother, Lenora Morel. Lenora was a woman who had survived things most people couldn't even imagine. She had immigrated to this country with $11 in her pocket, a baby on her hip, and a fire in her chest that refused to go out. She cleaned houses. She cooked for wealthy families. She saved every single penny. And she told Serafina something every single night before bed. She would cup the little girl's face in her weathered hands and say, "The world will try to make you small, mon coeur, but you were born to take up space. Remember that." Serafina remembered. She carried those words like armor through every hardship, through her mother's death when she was 19, through working 2 jobs to put herself through nursing school, through every landlord who looked at her like she was nothing, through every night she ate rice and beans for dinner because that was all she could afford. She carried those words and she survived. And then she met Maxim. She was 26, he was 32. She was working the late shift at St. Cecilia's Hospital, and he came in at 2 in the morning with a gash on his forehead from a fender bender. Nothing serious, just enough to bleed dramatically. He was wearing a suit that cost more than 3 months of her rent. His watch caught the fluorescent light and threw tiny rainbows on the ceiling. And when she leaned in to clean the wound, he looked at her with those sharp, grey eyes and said, "You have the steadiest hands I've ever seen." She didn't blush, she didn't flutter. She simply said, "That's because I've had a lot of practice keeping things together." He laughed, and something about that laugh, something unguarded and surprised. Like he hadn't expected to feel anything genuine in a sterile hospital room at 2 in the morning. That laugh cracked something open between them. He came back the next day, not because he needed medical attention, but because he wanted to see her again. He brought coffee not from a chain, but from an artisan roaster downtown that she'd walked past 100 times but never entered because a single cup cost $9. He brought it in a paper bag with her name misspelled on the cup. Serafina and she laughed and corrected him and took a sip and felt, for the first time in a very long time, like someone was paying attention. Maxim Kessler was the son of the late Helmut Kessler, a real estate mogul who had built half the commercial district in their city before dying of a heart attack at 61. Leaving behind a sprawling empire and a wife named Gertrude who ran the family like a military operation. Maxim was the eldest of 3 sons, the golden child, the heir apparent, the one whose portrait hung in the lobby of Kessler Holdings alongside his father's. He drove a matte black Bentley. He wore bespoke suits. He had a corner office on the 42nd floor of a building with his last name etched into the marble dot. And he chose Serafina. Not the socialites his mother paraded in front of him. Not the daughters of business partners with trust funds and perfect posture. He chose the nurse from Harrowcliff with the steady hands and the grandmother who had cleaned houses for a living. And at first Serafina thought it was because he saw something real in her, something true. There's something I want you to understand about this part of the story, because it matters. Serafina was not naive. She was not a woman who had been sheltered from the world, waiting for a prince to rescue her. She had buried her mother. She had worked double shifts until her feet bled. She had negotiated with landlords and fought for overtime pay and learned to check the oil in her own car, because there was no one else to do it. She was strong, she was smart, and that's exactly what makes what happened next so important to understand. Because Maxim didn't prey on weakness, he preyed on hope. And there's a difference, a cruel, devastating difference. Their courtship was a whirlwind. Maxim was charming in the way that powerful men often are, not because they try, but because they've been told their entire lives that the world bends for them, and so they move through it with a confidence that can feel, to someone who has never had that luxury, like warmth, like safety. He took her to restaurants where the menus didn't have prices. He flew her 2 weekends in places she'd only seen in magazines. He listened when she talked about her patients, about her grandmother, about the little apartment she was saving for. He listened, and he nodded, and he said, "You won't have to worry about any of that anymore." She should have heard the warning. In those words, "You won't have to worry" is often just another way of saying I'll be in control. But she didn't hear it. Not then. She heard kindness. She heard rescue. One night, about 4 months into their relationship, they were sitting on the balcony of his penthouse apartment, a temporary place he was staying while the mansion was being renovated, and Serafina told him about her grandmother, about the $11, about the houses she cleaned, about the way Lenora would come home exhausted, but would still sit at the kitchen table with young Serafina and help her with homework. Her hands cracked and raw, but her patience infinite. Maxim had listened, and then he had said, "She sounds like a remarkable woman," and Serafina had looked at him and thought, "He sees me, he actually sees me," but what Maxim actually saw was something different. He saw a woman without connections, without family wealth, without anyone powerful enough to challenge him. He saw a woman who would be grateful, and in Maxim's world, gratitude was the same thing as obedience. They married 11 months after. That first night in the hospital, the wedding was at the Kessler estate, a sprawling property on the outskirts of the city with manicured gardens, a private lake, and a guest house bigger than any home Serafina had ever lived in. Gertrude Kessler sat in the front row with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and a hat so large it could have shaded a small country. She had told Maxim, privately, that marrying Serafina was a phase. She had told him, with the particular cruelty that only mothers of wealthy sons can muster, that a woman without a pedigree will always embarrass you eventually. Maxim had waved her off. But Serafina saw the way Gertrude looked at her during the vows, the way her gaze traveled slowly from Seraphine's shoes to her dress to her face, cataloguing every flaw, every imperfection, every reason she didn't. But long Serafina moved into the Kessler mansion after the wedding. She gave up her apartment, her lease, her independence. She kept working at the hospital for a while. She loved her patients, loved the rhythm of it, loved feeling useful. But Maxim started making comments. Subtle, at first. "You're always tired when you come home. I don't understand why you need to work when I can provide everything." People are starting to talk, a Kessler wife working night shifts like she needs to. The comments became arguments. The arguments became ultimatums. And eventually, Serafina folded. She told herself it was a compromise. She told herself she could find other ways to feel fulfilled. She quit her job, and a small, quiet light inside her went out. The honeymoon was in the Maldives, 10 days in an overwater villa that cost more per night than Serafina had earned in a month of nursing. She remembered standing on the deck, watching the sun set over water so clear you could see fish swimming beneath the floor, and feeling a tightness in her chest that she mistook for happiness but was actually the beginning of something else. Because even there, even in paradise, the signs were present. Maxim controlled the itinerary. Maxim chose the restaurants. When Serafina suggested a snorkeling trip she'd read about, he said, "That's for tourists, Sir, we're not tourists." It was such a small thing, such an insignificant moment. But it was the first time she swallowed her own desire to accommodate his, and the swallowing became a habit, and the habit became her life. The first year of marriage was a masterclass in slow erosion. Maxim wasn't violent, not then, he was. Something worse. He was dismissive. He made decisions without consulting her. He moved her grandmother's old armoire, the only piece of furniture Serafina had brought from her old life, into the storage room because it didn't match the aesthetic. He corrected her pronunciation at dinner parties. He interrupted her stories to tell better ones. He slowly, methodically, taught her that her voice was less important than his. And then there was Gertrude. Maxim's mother visited the mansion at least 3 times a week, always unannounced, always with opinions. She criticized Seraphine's cooking, her clothing, the way she arranged the flowers, the way she spoke to the house staff. She once told Serafina, over tea, with a sugar cube dissolving slowly in her porcelain cup, "You know, dear, breeding isn't something you can learn. It's something you're born with, and some people simply aren't." Serafina sat there, cup trembling, in her hands, and said nothing. Because by then, she had learned that saying nothing was easier than fighting battles she could never win. But even in the darkest rooms, sometimes, a light appears. Serafina found out she was pregnant on a cold morning in February. She took the test alone in the bathroom, sitting on the edge of the marble tub, and when those two lines appeared, she didn't cry, she didn't scream. She placed her hand on her stomach and whispered, "Hello, little one. I'm going to protect you, I promise." She told Maxime that evening over dinner. She had planned it carefully, his favorite meal, candles, a small gift box, with a pair of tiny knitted booties inside. She watched his face as he opened it, and for a moment, just a moment, she saw something genuine flicker across his features. Surprise, wonder, maybe even tenderness. He stood up, he walked around the table, he put his hands on her shoulders and said, "A Kessler, not our baby. Not this is wonderful, a Kessler." Like the child was a line item on a balance sheet, but Serafina let herself hope. She let herself believe that this baby would change things. That fatherhood would soften Maxime's edges, open his heart, remind him that there were things in this world more important than power and perception. She was wrong. The pregnancy progressed, and so did Maxime's indifference. He attended the first ultrasound appointment but spent most of it on his phone, negotiating a property deal. He missed the second one entirely. He never asked how she was feeling. He never rubbed her swollen feet or brought her the mango sorbet she craved at midnight or held her hair back during the morning sickness that lasted well into her second trimester. He was a ghost in his own home, present physically, absent in every way that mattered. There were moments, though brief, flickering moments, when the old Maxim would surface. One night, about 6 months into the pregnancy, woke up at 3 in the morning with terrible heartburn, and she found Maxim already awake, sitting in the kitchen, drinking whiskey and staring at nothing. She sat down across from him, and for a few minutes there were just two people in a quiet house. He looked at her belly and said, very softly, "I hope the baby looks like you." It was so unexpected, so gentle, that Seraphine's eyes filled with tears. She reached across the table and touched his hand, and he let her hold it for almost a minute, before he pulled away and said, "Go back to bed. You need rest." Those moments were the cruelest part, not because they were lies, but because they were real. Somewhere inside Maxim Kessler, buried beneath the entitlement and the rage and the desperate need to control everything around him, there was a person capable of tenderness. But that person was locked in a room that Maxim himself had sealed shut, and no amount of love from Serafina could find the key. And then Camille arrived. Camille Devoro. Even her name sounded like a threat wrapped in silk. She was brought into Kessler Holdings as a strategic consultant, tall, sharp-featured, with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing exactly how much space you deserve. She had an MBA from a school whose name alone opened doors, and she wore it like a crown. Maxim mentioned her casually at first. "Camille had a brilliant idea in the meeting today. Camille and I are working late on the Harborview project. Camille understands the business in a way that most people don't." Serafina felt it before she saw it. The way his eyes would light up when his phone buzzed. The way he started caring about his appearance again. New cologne, fresh haircuts, shirts pressed twice. The way he stopped coming home for dinner. The late nights became later. The business trips became more frequent. And the distance between them, which had always been there, became an ocean. The affair, because that's what it was. Despite every euphemism Maxim would later hide behind, didn't announce itself with a single dramatic moment. It crept in like water through a crack in a foundation. It was the way Maxim started locking his phone. The way he would take calls in another room and close the door. The way he came home one night smelling like a perfume that wasn't so. A sharp, sophisticated scent that lodged itself in Seraphine's memory like a splinter. She lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to him shower, and she felt something she hadn't felt since childhood. The particular loneliness of being in a house full of people and knowing that none of them are yours. She confronted him once, gently, carefully, 7 months pregnant. Standing in the kitchen, in her bathrobe, she asked, "Is there something going on with you and Camille?" His reaction was immediate and volcanic. "Don't you dare. he hissed, his face contorting into something she barely recognized. Don't you dare stand there in my kitchen, in the house that I paid for, and accuse me of something so disgusting. You have no idea what I sacrifice every day for this family. No idea. He slammed his hand on the counter so hard the fruit bowl rattled, and a single apple rolled off the edge and hit the floor with a dull thud that echoed in the silence that followed. He left the room. Serafina stood there, one hand on her belly, the other gripping the counter for support, and she thought, this is not the man I married. But the truth was darker than that. This was exactly the man she had married. She just hadn't been able to see it clearly until now. What Serafina didn't know, what she wouldn't discover until much later, was that her grandmother Leonora had not been a simple housekeeper. Not entirely. Leonora Morel had cleaned houses, yes. She had scrubbed floors and polished silver and laundered sheets for the wealthy. But Leonora was also brilliant. Quietly, stubbornly brilliant. In the margins of her exhausting days, she had studied, she had learned, and she had invested small amounts at first, $50 here, $100 there, in property, in land, in small buildings that nobody wanted, in neighborhoods that nobody believed in. She bought them under a trust she had created with the help of a young lawyer named Ashworth, Reginald Ashworth, who had taken her case pro bono because she reminded him of his own grandmother. Over 30 years, those investments had grown quietly, steadily, like a tree that no one notices until it towers over the house. When Leonora passed away peacefully in her sleep 3 years before Seraphine's wedding, she left behind a will that was locked in Reginald Ashworth's office. Serafina, deep in grief and overwhelmed with funeral arrangements, had never fully reviewed the details. She knew her grandmother had left her some properties and a trust, but she assumed they were modest, a small rental unit, maybe a patch of land somewhere. She signed the papers Ashworth put in front of her and tucked the folder into a drawer and never looked at it again. She had no idea that among those properties was a piece of land. A specific piece of land, a prime 5-acre parcel on the outskirts of the city that had been purchased by Leonora Morel in 1987 for almost nothing because back then it was a muddy field next to a highway on a parcel that, over the decades, had become the most valuable undeveloped lot in the entire metropolitan area, a parcel that a certain real estate company had built upon. Without properly clearing the title, that company was Kessler Holdings. And the mansion, the grand, sprawling Kessler mansion where Serafina now lived, where she had been diminished and silenced and slowly erased, was built on her grandmother's land. But that revelation was still weeks away. First, there was the birthday party. Maxim's 38th birthday celebration was, in his mind, a coronation. He had recently closed the biggest deal of his career, the Harborview Marina project, a waterfront development that would cement Kessler Holdings as the dominant force in the city's real estate market. He wanted the party to reflect his success. He wanted it grand, he wanted it excessive. He wanted every person in that room to look at him and know that he had one. The guest list was curated like a gallery exhibition. Politicians, investors, society columnists, old money and new money, and everything in between. The house was transformed. White roses by the thousands. A champagne tower that reached the ceiling. A 12-piece band flown in from somewhere Serafina had never heard of. A cake designed by a pastry chef who had his own television show. Expense was spared. Serafina spent the week before the party preparing, not because she wanted to, her back ached constantly now. And the baby had dropped lower, pressing against her pelvis with a weight that made every step feel monumental, but because Maxim had made it clear that her appearance was a reflection of him, and any failure on her part would be interpreted as disrespect. So she found a dress, a deep burgundy gown that accommodated her belly while still looking elegant. She had her hair done. She put on the diamond earrings he had given her on their first anniversary, the ones that felt less like a gift and more like a brand, the night of the party. Serafina stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a long time before going downstairs. She studied her reflection, the swollen cheeks, the dark circles under her eyes that concealer couldn't fully hide. The way her body had changed to accommodate a life that she loved fiercely, even though the man who had helped create it seemed incapable of loving anything beyond himself. She placed her hands on her belly and felt the baby move, a slow, rolling movement, like a wave, and she said, "We're going to get through tonight. You and me, together." Then she put on the diamond earrings, straightened her shoulders, and opened the bathroom door. She descended the staircase to a room already full of people. The music was playing, the champagne was flowing, and Maxim was standing in the center of it all, radiant, commanding, holding court like a king. But he wasn't alone. Camille Devereaux was beside him. Not across the room, not at a respectful distance. Beside him, a hand on his arm, a laugh harmonizing with his. She was wearing a black dress that fit her like a second skin, and she was leaning into Maxim with the casual intimacy of someone who had nothing to hide. Serafina felt something cold slide through her chest. She stood on the last step of the staircase, one hand on the railing, watching her husband laugh with another woman at his own birthday party while she carried his child. No one noticed her for a full 30 seconds. When Maxim finally looked up and saw her, he didn't rush over, he didn't smile warmly. He glanced at her. The way you glance at a piece of furniture you forgot to move, Serafina. Good. Come meet everyone. She walked through that party like a ghost. She smiled when spoken to. She accepted compliments on the decorations that she had chosen, and the food that she had tasted, and the flowers that she had arranged. She watched Camille move through the room like she owned it, touching Maxim's back, whispering in his ear, accepting a glass of champagne from his hand as naturally as breathing. Gertrude was there, of course. She found Serafina standing alone by the window and said, without preamble, "You look tired, dear. Pregnancy doesn't suit everyone. Some women glow. Others just ... swell." Then she patted Seraphine's arm and glided away to greet a senator's wife. It happened at 10:30. The cake had just been brought out, 5 tiers. White fondant, gold leaf accents. His initials monogrammed on top. The band played Happy Birthday, 112 voices sang. Maxim blew out the candles. Applause erupted, and then Serafina, standing beside her husband as was expected, leaned in and said something. She said it quietly. She said it for his ears only. She said, "Can we talk? Please, just for a moment. I need to tell you something." What she wanted to tell him was that she had been spotting, that she'd been having cramps, that she was scared for the baby and wanted to leave the party and go to the hospital. It was not an unreasonable request. It was not a dramatic plea. It was a pregnant woman asking her husband for help. Maxime looked at her. His smile didn't waver, but his eyes went cold. Cold like steel, cold like the marble floors of the house. She was standing in, and through clenched teeth, so quietly that only she could hear. He said, "Not now. Don't ruin this." Seraphine's hand found his sleeve. She tugged gently. "Maxime, please. I'm worried about the..." He pulled his arm away. The movement was sharp enough that the people standing closest to them noticed. A woman with a pearl necklace raised an eyebrow. A man in a tuxedo shifted uncomfortably. And then Serafina, driven by fear for her child, did the one thing Maxim could never forgive. She raised her voice, not to a shout, not to a scream, just loud enough for the nearest cluster of guests to hear. "Maxim, I think something is wrong with the baby. I need to go to the hospital." The room didn't stop. Not yet. But heads turned. Conversations paused. And Maxime Kessler, who had spent his entire life controlling every room he entered, felt the one thing he could not tolerate, the loss of his audience's admiration. In his mind, she wasn't asking for help. She was humiliating. She was stealing his moment. She was making him look weak, unprepared, out of control. He turned to face her. His jaw was set. His eyes were blazing. And in front of 112 guests, in front of his mother, in front of Camille Devereaux, in front of the champagne tower and the 5-tier cake and the 12-piece band, and every person he had ever wanted to impress, Maxim Kessler raised his hand and slapped his pregnant wife across the face so hard that her head snapped to the side and a gasp tore through the room like fabric ripping, but the sound was sharp, final, like a door slamming shut on everything. Serafina stumbled. She caught herself on the edge of the table. A champagne glass toppled and shattered on the marble floor. She stood there, one hand on her burning cheek, the other wrapped around her belly, and she looked at him. She didn't cry, she didn't scream. She looked at him with eyes that held something far more devastating than tears. She looked at him with clarity. Complete, total, irreversible clarity. The room was frozen. A woman near the back covered her mouth. With her hand, a man set down his glass with a deliberate, disgusted precision. And Gertrude Kessler, sitting in her gilded chair, said absolutely nothing. She simply took a sip of her champagne. That Maxim realized what he had done in the space of about 3 seconds. The rage drained from his face, replaced by something that looked like fear, not fear of consequences, but fear of exposure. He had shown the monster, and the room had seen it. He straightened his jacket, he ran a hand through his hair. And then, incredibly, unbelievably, he laughed. A tight, controlled laugh, and he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "She gets dramatic when she's tired. You know how pregnant women are." No one laughed with him. Serafina turned and walked toward the staircase. Slowly, deliberately. Each step was agony, not from the slap, but from the weight of 100 stares and the silence of 100 people who had witnessed her humiliation and done nothing. She climbed the stairs with her hand on the banister and disappeared into the upstairs hallway. And the sound of her bedroom door closing was the quietest, most devastating sound that house had ever heard. Downstairs, the party attempted to resume. Maxim worked the room with renewed energy, refilling glasses, making jokes, touching shoulders. Most people played along, but the atmosphere had changed. There was a stiffness now, a discomfort that no amount of champagne could dissolve. And in the corner by the bar, a man named Tobias Crane, Maxim's business partner and oldest friend, stood watching with an expression that was impossible to read that Tobias had known Maxim since prep school. They had built Kessler Holdings together, though Maxim's name was the one on the building. Tobias was the quiet one, the numbers man, the one who read contracts while Maxim shook hands. He had watched Maxim's behavior toward Serafina with growing unease for months. The dismissiveness, the cruelty, the way Maxim talked about her when she wasn't in the room. She's decorative. Tobias. That's her job. Tobias had said nothing, because saying something would have meant risking the partnership, the company, everything they had built. But watching Maxim strike a pregnant woman in a room full of people, something inside Tobias shifted. Something fundamental and irreversible. Didn't confront Maxim that night, but he made a phone call the next morning. Not to a therapist. Not to a mutual friend. To a lawyer. Not just any lawyer. He called Reginald Ashworth. "Now, I need to tell you about Nadia. Because Nadia is the reason Serafina survived the next 48 hours. Nadia Okafor was Serafin's closest friend. They had met in nursing school. Two young women running on caffeine and determination. And they had formed the kind of friendship that doesn't need daily maintenance to remain unbreakable. Nadia was everything Serafina was not: loud, opinionated, unapologetic, the kind of woman who walked into a room and rearranged the energy in it. She had never liked Maxim. She had told Serafina this directly, on multiple occasions, with a bluntness. That was her signature. "He doesn't love you, Sarah. He loves what you make him look like. There's a difference." Serafina had always deflected. "You don't see the side of him I see." But as the marriage deteriorated, the calls to Nadia had become more frequent, more tearful, more desperate. Nadia had been keeping a quiet record of everything Serafina told her, every insult, every manipulation, every humiliation, not because she was plotting, because she knew, with the instinct of someone who had watched her own mother endure a violent marriage, that one day Serafina would need proof that she wasn't crazy. The morning after the birthday party, Serafina called Nadia from the guest bathroom, the only room in the mansion without security cameras. Her voice was hoarse, her cheek was bruised, and for the first time in their friendship, Serafina didn't downplay it. She said, "He hit me. In front of everyone, Nadia, he hit me." Nadia was at the mansion within the hour. She didn't knock. She walked in through the kitchen entrance, the one the staff used, and found Serafina sitting on the bathroom floor with her knees drawn up as far as her belly would allow. Nadia knelt beside her and said, "We're leaving today." But Serafina shook her head. "I can't. I have nowhere to go. Everything is in his name. The bank accounts, the cars. But then we make a plan," Nadia said. "A quiet one. But we make it today." Maxim, meanwhile, was operating in damage control mode. He made phone calls to key guests, spinning the narrative. "You know how emotional pregnancy hormones can be. She provoked me. You didn't see what happened before you arrived. It looked worse than it was." He sent flowers to the wives of his most important contacts with notes that read, "Thank you for a wonderful evening." He even had Gertrude call a few society matriarchs to assure them that everything was fine, that Serafina was resting comfortably, that the family was united. But the video was already circulating. Someone at the party, it was never confirmed who, had been recording on their phone when it happened. The clip was 23 seconds long. It showed Maxim turning. It showed his hand rising. It showed the impact. It showed Serafina stumbling, and it showed Maxim laughing afterward, 23 seconds that would eventually be viewed by more than 11 million people. But that came later. In the immediate aftermath, the video was shared quietly, in private messages and group chats, among the social circle that had been present that night, and one of the people who received it was a journalist named Priya Narang, who wrote for the city's most prominent magazine and who had been at the party as the guest of a mutual acquaintance. Priya watched the video 7 times. Then she made a phone call to her editor. The night after the party, Serafina didn't sleep. She lay in the guest bedroom. She had stopped sleeping in the master bedroom weeks ago. As she pressed her hand against the bruise on her cheek and felt it throb, in time with her heartbeat, the baby was restless too, kicking and turning, responding to the cortisol flooding Seraphine's bloodstream. She talked to the baby all night. She told her about Leonora, about Heraclive, about the sea air that tasted like salt and sadness. She told her about nursing school, about the first time she held a patient's hand while they died, and understood that presence is sometimes the only medicine that matters. She talked until her voice was hoarse, and the talking kept her anchored, kept her from drowning in the shame and the fear and the terrible, gnawing question that every abused woman asks herself in the dark. Was this my fault? It was not her fault. It was not her fault. It was never her fault, and if you're listening to this and you've ever asked yourself that question, I need you to hear me. It was not your fault either. 3 days after the birthday party, Serafina went to the hospital. Not because of the slap though, the bruise on her cheek was still visible, but because the cramping had worsened. Dr. Farouk, her obstetrician, a calm and meticulous woman who had been practicing for 27 years, ran tests and performed an ultrasound. The baby was okay, stressed, but okay. But Dr. Farouk noticed something else, a slightly elevated blood pressure reading that, combined with the visible bruising and Seraphine's evasive answers about how she was feeling at home, painted a picture that the doctor had seen too many times. She didn't push. Not directly. Instead, she handed Serafina a brochure for a domestic violence support line and said, I'm giving this to all my patients this month, just in case anyone needs it. Their eyes met, and in that look, more was communicated than words could carry. Serafina took the brochure. She folded it into the smallest square possible and tucked it into her wallet behind her insurance card. That same week, Maxim received a phone call that rattled him. It was from Reginald Ashworth, introducing himself as an attorney representing a matter related to certain Kessler Holdings properties. Maxim barely listened. He assumed it was about a zoning dispute or a tenant complaint, routine business. He told his assistant to forward the call to the legal department and didn't think about it again. This was a mistake, perhaps the biggest of his life, because Reginald Ashworth hadn't called about a zoning dispute. He had called because Tobias Crane, Maxim's own business partner, had come to him with a question. Is it possible that the Kessler estate was built on land that wasn't properly acquired? And Ashworth, who had spent 30 years managing Lenora Morell's trust, who had watched that trust grow from a handful of modest properties into something remarkable, had pulled the files. He had checked the title, he had cross-referenced the land surveys, and what he had found made him sit down very slowly in his chair and take off his glasses and rub his eyes. The land beneath the Kessler mansion, the crown jewel of the family's personal holdings, had never been transferred. The original purchase agreement, executed by Helmut Kessler in 1995, referenced a parcel number that didn't match the actual parcel. It was a clerical error, buried in decades of paperwork, overlooked by a series of lawyers who assumed that a family as powerful as the Kesslers would never build a mansion on land they didn't own, but they had. The parcel beneath the mansion, every blade of grass, every stone in the foundation, every inch of the driveway belonged to the Morell family trust. It belonged to Serafina. Ashworth didn't tell her immediately. He needed to verify everything first. He spent 2 weeks pulling records, consulting title specialists, reviewing the trust documents that Lenora had signed decades ago. The findings were airtight. The land was Serafine's. It had always been Serafine's, and Lenora had purchased it, held it, and passed it down, and no one in the Kessler family had ever realized that the ground beneath their empire was not theirs. Meanwhile, at the mansion, the atmosphere had become unbearable. Maxime, shaken by the whispered gossip following the birthday party, had turned his anxiety into aggression, not physical again, but verbal, relentless, and strategic. He began suggesting, loudly and often, that Serafina was mentally unstable. She's been erratic, he told his mother. The pregnancy is affecting her mind. He even called Dr. Farouk's office, requesting Seraphine's medical records. claiming he was concerned about her psychological state. Dr. Farouk refused, citing patient confidentiality, and made a note in Seraphine's file. Maxim also began moving money. He transferred funds from their joint account into a personal one. He put the vacation properties in Gertrude's name. He had a prenuptial agreement, one that Serafina had signed without fully understanding its implications, that he believed would protect him in any divorce. He was building walls, fortifying his position, preparing for a war he was certain Woodward and Camille was with him through all of it. She was in the house now, openly, not living there, but present, arriving in the morning, leaving late at night, her coat draped over the back of the chair that Serafina used to sit in. Maxim didn't even bother hiding it anymore. When Serafina asked him, quietly, who Camille was to him, he looked at her with open contempt and said, "She's someone who understands my world, something you never could." Serafina took those words and added them to the collection she was building inside herself. A collection of cruelties, catalogued not for revenge but for clarity. Each one was a brick in the wall she was constructing between the woman she had been and the woman she was becoming. It was Nadia who connected the dots. Nadia, who had been quietly researching Seraphine's legal options, stumbled upon the name Reginald Ashworth while looking through Seraphine's grandmother's old papers. She called his office, she explained who she was, and Ashworth, after verifying her identity, said, "I've been trying to reach Serafina. I have information that will change everything." Before the meeting with Ashworth, something else happened that deserves to be told. Serafina received a phone call from an unknown number. When she answered, the voice on the other end was hesitant, almost apologetic. "Mrs. Kessler, my name is Tobias Crane. I'm your husband's business partner." Seraphine's hand tightened around the phone. She knew the name. She had seen Tobias at dinners, at company events, always in the background, always watching. "I want you to know," Tobias continued, "that what happened at that party was unconscionable, and I want you to know that you have more power than you think. Please talk to Reginald Ashworth. He has information you need." The line went dead. Serafina stood in the kitchen holding the phone and she felt something shift. Not dramatically, not with the crash of thunder or the swell of orchestral music, but quietly, like a key turning in a lock that had been stuck for years. The meeting took place on a Tuesday afternoon in Ashworth's office, a modest, book-lined room above a dry cleaner's shop that smelled like old paper and coffee. Serafina sat across from the elderly lawyer, her belly enormous now, her face tired, her eyes wary. Nadia sat beside her, holding her hand. Ashworth placed a folder on the desk. He opened it slowly, deliberately, and began to speak. He told Serafina about investments, about the trust, about the properties her grandmother had accumulated over decades of quiet, brilliant persistence. He showed her the numbers, the total value of the trust, the list of properties, the rental income that had been accumulating in an account Serafina didn't even know existed. Serafina stared at the figures. Her lips parted. She blinked. She looked at Nadia, then back at Ashworth. "This can't be right," she whispered. "It is," Ashworth said gently. "Your grandmother was an extraordinary woman." And then he told her about the land, he told her about the parcel, about the clerical error, about the fact that the Kessler mansion, the house where she had been diminished, silenced, slapped, and humiliated, was built on ground that her grandmother had purchased 30 years before Maxim Kessler was born. The room went very quiet. Seraphine's hand moved to her belly. She felt the baby kick, a strong, insistent kick, as if the child inside her understood, on some primal level, that something monumental had just shifted. "What does this mean?" she asked. Ashworth leaned back in his chair. He looked at her, over the rim of his glasses, and he said, in a voice that was calm and precise and carried the weight of 30 years of legal expertise, "It means, Serafina, that the house belongs to you." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of every night Serafina had spent crying in a bathroom, full of every insult Gertrude had delivered, full that every time Maxime had made her feel like she was nothing without him, full of the sound of that slap echoing through a room of 112 people who had done nothing. Nadia squeezed her hand. Serafina closed her eyes, and for the first time in a very long time, she breathed. But this was not the end. This was the beginning. Ashworth laid out the options. They could negotiate quietly. They could file a legal claim. Or they could wait. "The strongest position," he said, "is one where the other side doesn't see you coming." Serafina, who had spent her entire marriage learning how to be invisible, understood this better than anyone, so she went home. She walked back into that mansion and she cooked dinner and she smiled at Maxim when he walked through the door and she said nothing. She played the part he had written for her, the quiet, obedient, insignificant wife. But inside, something had ignited. A flame that had been passed down from a woman who had arrived in this country. With $11 and a baby on her hip and a fire that refused to go out. The next 2 weeks were a chess game played in silence. Ashworth prepared the legal documents. Nadia helped Serafina gather evidence, screenshots of Maxim's financial movements, recordings of conversations where he admitted to hiding assets, a copy of the video from the birthday party that Narang had obtained. Serafina moved through the mansion like a woman in a trance, but beneath the surface, she was sharper than she had ever been. She also discovered something she hadn't expected. While going through the files Ashworth had given her, she found a letter handwritten in Lenora's distinctive slanted script. It was dated 3 years before Lenora's death, and it was addressed to Serafina Moncourt. It read, "If you are reading this, then Ashworth has told you about the trust. I know you are probably shocked. I know you probably think I should have told you sooner, but I wanted you to build your own strength first. I wanted you to know that you could survive on your own before you knew that you didn't have to. The world tried to make me small, Serafina. It tried to make your mother small. It will try to make you small too. But we are not small women. We never were. Whatever you are facing, remember, the ground beneath your feet is yours. It has always been yours." Serafina read the letter 3 times. Then she pressed it against her chest and wept. Not from sadness. From the overwhelming realization that she had never been alone. That her grandmother's love had been working on her behalf for decades. Building a foundation beneath her that was stronger than anything the Kesslers could construct. During those weeks of preparation, Serafina experienced something she hadn't anticipated. Peace. Not happiness that was still distant, still theoretical, but a deep, calm peace that came from finally having a direction. She knew where she was going. She knew what she was worth. She even began sleeping better, curled around her enormous belly in the guest bedroom, the letter from Lenora tucked under her pillow like a talisman. She dreamed about her grandmother. Not the old, frail woman who had died in her sleep, but the young one, the woman who had stepped off a boat with $11 and a fire in her chest. In the dream, Leona was walking ahead of her on a long, sunlit path. And she kept turning back to make sure Serafina was following. She never said anything in the dream. She didn't need to. Her eyes said everything. Keep going. I'm right here. Keep going. The confrontation came on a Thursday morning. Maxim was in his home office reviewing contracts when his assistant buzzed through with a message. "Mr. Ashworth is here. He says it's urgent." Maxim frowned. He vaguely remembered the name. He told his assistant to send him in. Expecting a quick conversation about some minor legal matter, Reginald Ashworth walked into Maxim's office carrying a leather briefcase that was older than Maxim himself. He was 73 years old, with white hair combed neatly back, and a posture that belonged to a man who had spent his life standing up straight in rooms full of people who underestimated him. He extended his hand. Maxim shook it limply. "Mr. Kessler, thank you for seeing me. Make it quick, I have calls." Ashworth sat down. He opened his briefcase. He removed a stack of documents and placed them on the desk with the precision of a surgeon laying out instruments. And then he began. He explained the land title issue in clear, methodical terms. He showed Maxim the original deed. He showed him the trust documents. He showed him the title search results, the surveyor's reports, the chain of ownership that led, inexorably, inevitably, back to Lenora Morel. Maxim's face went through a series of transformations. Confusion, disbelief, irritation, and then, as the reality began to sink in, something that looked very much like fear. "This is absurd," he said. "My father built this house. He owned this land. Your father built on this land," Ashworth corrected gently. "He did not own it. The parcel was purchased by my client's grandmother in 1987. Your father's acquisition in 1995 referenced an incorrect parcel number. The actual parcel beneath this structure was never transferred to the Kessler family. Who is your client?" Maxim demanded. Asterisk. Ashworth paused. He straightened the documents. He looked Maxim directly in the eye. And he said, "My client is your wife, Serafina Morel Kessler." The silence that followed was absolute. Maxim stared at Ashworth. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. The color drained from his face. He looked at the documents on his desk, the signatures, the dates, the legal language that, despite his wealth and power and connections, he could not argue with, could not bribe away, could not make disappear. That's impossible, he whispered. I assure you, Mr. Kessler, it is not. The title is clear. The trust is properly established. The chain of ownership is unbroken. This house and the land it sits on belongs to Serafina. Ashworth gathered his papers with calm efficiency. My client is not, at this time, requesting that you vacate the property, but she is asserting her rights, and given recent events, here his voice took on a slight edge, including events that were witnessed by a great number of people and recorded on video, she would also be pursuing additional legal remedies. He stood, he buttoned his jacket, he picked up his briefcase, and at the door, he turned back and said, Mr. Kessler, I have been practicing law for 47 years. In that time I have learned that the people who shout the loudest about what they own are usually the ones standing on borrowed ground. Good day. Maxim sat in his office for 45 minutes after Ashworth left. He didn't make calls. He didn't move. He sat behind his enormous desk in his enormous house that was suddenly, devastatingly not his, and he felt something he had never felt before in his entire gilded life. Powerlessness. Then the rage came. He stormed through the house looking for Serafina. He found her in the nursery, the room she had spent weeks preparing for the baby, painting the walls a soft sage green, assembling the crib with her own hands because Maxim had refused to help. She was sitting in the rocking chair, her hands folded over her belly, and when he burst through the door, she looked up at him without flinching. What did you do? He shouted. What the hell did you do? I didn't do anything, she said. Her voice was steady, remarkably, impossibly steady. My grandmother did. This is my house. My family built this house. My father. Your father built on land he didn't own. That's not my fault. It's not my grandmother's fault. It's a fact. I'll fight this. I'll get every lawyer in the city to. You can try. She stood up slowly, one hand on the armrest, the other on her belly. She was enormous, glowing, powerful in a way that had nothing to do with money or status or the things Maxim valued. But while you're doing that, maybe you should know that the video from your birthday party has been sent to every news outlet in the city, that your financial records, the ones showing you moved assets to avoid equitable distribution, are now with my attorney. Farouk has documented a pattern of stress-related symptoms in my medical records that are consistent with domestic abuse. Maxim's face twisted. You planned this? No, Serafina said. I survived this. There's a difference. Maxim stared at her. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. For the first time in his life, Maxim Kessler had no words, no argument, no strategy, no leverage. Every tool he had ever used to maintain control, money, intimidation, charm, family name, was useless. The woman standing in front of him, 8 months pregnant, bruised, exhausted, and more powerful than he had ever been, had outmaneuvered him without raising her voice. Not through cunning, not through deception. Through the simple, devastating act of knowing the truth and refusing to be afraid of it. His hands were shaking. She noticed, and she felt something she didn't expect, pity. Not the condescending pity of the powerful toward the powerless, but the deep, sad pity of a person who understands that the man in front of her was never taught how to love. And probably never would be. She felt it for exactly 3 seconds. Then she remembered the slap. The sound of it. The way 112 people had watched. The way Gertrude had sipped her champagne, and the pity evaporated like morning dew under a hot sun, replaced by something harder and more durable. Resolve. She walked past him. She walked out of the nursery, down the hallway, down the staircase. The same staircase she had descended on the night of his birthday party, when she had been nothing but a decoration, but this time she walked with a different posture. Straighter, taller. Like a woman who knew the ground beneath her feet was hers. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. Fred Narang's article was published the following morning. The headline read, "The Kessler Slap, Inside the Most Powerful Family's Darkest Secret." The article detailed the birthday party incident, the video, and, citing anonymous sources, the land dispute. It painted a portrait of Maxim as a man whose public image of success and charm concealed a private reality of cruelty and entitlement. It went viral within hours. Kessler Holdings stock plummeted. Investors called emergency meetings. The board of directors, which included two of Maxim's relatives, convened behind closed doors. Tobias Crane, who had started all of this with a single phone call to Ashworth, presented the board with a choice: distance the company from Maxim or watch the brand collapse. Gertrude Kessler, for the first time in her life, was rendered speechless, not by the land revelation. She dismissed that as some clerical nonsense that lawyers will sort out, but by the public humiliation, the phone calls from her friends, the whispered conversations at her club, the way her hairdresser had asked with careful concern, "Is everything all right at home, Mrs. Kessler?" Gertrude was a woman who survived on reputation, and Maxim had detonated hers. She turned on him, not out of love for Serafina. Gertrude would never love Serafina, but out of self-preservation. She called Maxim and said in a voice like cracking ice, "You have embarrassed this family beyond repair. I told you that girl would be trouble, but I never imagined the trouble would come from your own stupidity." Maxim, cornered from every direction, did what cornered men of power often do. He tried to buy his way out. He called Ashworth's office and offered to settle. He offered Serafina money, a lot of money in exchange for dropping the land claim and signing a non-disclosure agreement. He offered her a house, a car, a monthly allowance. He offered her everything he thought she wanted because he had never understood what she actually needed. Ashworth brought the offer to Serafina. She read it carefully. She set it down on the table. And she said, "No. No." Ashworth raised an eyebrow. "No. I don't want his money. I don't want a settlement. I want a divorce. I want full custody of my child. And I want him out of my grandmother's house." Ashworth looked at her for a long moment. Then he smiled, a small, warm, grandfatherly smile. "Your grandmother would be very proud." The legal proceedings moved swiftly, partly because the evidence was overwhelming, and partly because Maxim's own legal team advised him to cooperate. The prenuptial agreement, which Maxim had once wielded like a weapon, was challenged on the grounds that Serafina had signed it without independent legal counsel. A fact that, combined with the documented pattern of coercive control, rendered it voidable. The financial manipulation was exposed, the hidden accounts were frozen, and the land title issue, which Maxim's lawyers tried desperately to contest, was upheld by two separate courts. Camille Devereaux, sensing the shifting winds, disappeared. She resigned from Kessler Holdings on a Friday, and was gone by Monday, leaving behind nothing but a half-empty perfume bottle on Maxim's desk, and a reputation she would spend years trying to rebuild. Tobias Crane assumed interim control of Kessler Holdings. He called Serafina personally, the first and only time they spoke, and said, "I'm sorry I didn't do something sooner." Serafina paused for a moment, then said, "You did something when it mattered. That counts." The baby came 3 weeks after the legal proceedings began. Serafina went into labor at 4 in the morning on a Wednesday. Nadia drove her to the hospital, speeding through empty streets with the windows down and the radio off, and Serafina gripped a door handle and breathed through the contractions and thought about her grandmother, about the $11, about the baby on the hip, about the fire that refused to go out. The delivery was long and difficult, 14 hours of labor that tested every ounce of strength Serafina had left. But at 6:17 in the evening, with the setting sun painting the hospital room in shades of gold and amber, she heard the cry. Sharp, insistent, alive. A girl, 7 pounds 4 ounces, dark hair, grey eyes that looked heartbreakingly like her father's. But her grip, the tiny, impossibly strong grip of her fingers around Serafina's thumb, that was all Lenora. Serafina named her Margot Lenora Morel, not Kessler. Morel. Nadia was the first to hold her. She cradled the baby with surprising tenderness for a woman who had once described herself as allergic to small humans, and said, "Well, little one, your mom is the toughest person I know. You've got good genes." Maxim was not present for the birth. He had not been invited. He had not asked. In the weeks between the confrontation and the divorce proceedings, something unexpected happened. Gertrude Kessler requested a meeting with Serafina. not through lawyers but directly, a phone call, stiff and formal, asking if they could speak privately. Serafina agreed, partly out of curiosity and partly because she had learned that information is power, and Gertrude might provide some without realizing it. They met at a cafe downtown, neutral territory. Gertrude arrived in a cashmere coat and sunglasses, despite the overcast sky, her posture impeccable, her expression unreadable. She sat across from Serafina and ordered an espresso and said nothing for almost 2 full minutes. Then she said, "I underestimated you." Serafina waited. "I thought you were simple," Gertrude continued, each word extracted from her like a tooth. "I thought you married my son for his money and that eventually you'd fade into the background the way women like you do. I was wrong about you. And I was wrong about my son, not about what he is. I've always known what he is. I was wrong to think that what he is wouldn't eventually destroy everything." It was not an apology. Gertrude Kessler was not a woman who apologized, but it was an acknowledgement, and from a woman who had spent her life refusing to acknowledge anything that didn't fit her narrative. It was seismic. Serafina looked at her mother-in-law, soon-to-be former mother-in-law, and said, "Your son hit me in front of 100 people, Gertrude, and you sat there and sipped your champagne." Gertrude's cup paused halfway to her lips. Something flickered in her eyes, not guilt exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that lived in the same neighborhood. She set the cup down and said, "I have spent my entire life protecting this family's image. I confused the image with the family. That is my failing." She stood. She buttoned her coat. She walked to the door. And then she stopped and said, without turning around, "Take care of that little girl. She deserves better than what we gave you." She left. Serafina sat in the cafe for another 20 minutes, stirring a coffee she didn't drink, processing what had just happened. It wasn't forgiveness. It would never be forgiveness. But it was the closest thing to honesty she had ever received from the Kessler family. The divorce was finalized 4 months later. Serafina received full custody of Margot. She received the house, which was legally hers already, a fact that the judge noted with what appeared to be thinly veiled amusement. She received a substantial financial settlement, not from generosity but from a court that had reviewed the evidence of financial abuse and asset concealment and ruled accordingly. The prenuptial agreement was thrown out. Maxim was ordered to pay child support, spousal maintenance, and a penalty for the hidden accounts. He was also charged with assault. The video, which had by this point been viewed by millions, was entered as evidence. Several witnesses from the party provided statements. Maxim's lawyers negotiated a plea deal that kept him out of prison but required community service, anger management courses, and a restraining order that prohibited him from coming within 500 feet of Serafina or Margot. The day Maxim moved out of the mansion his father had built, on the land that Lenora Morel had bought with money she'd earned scrubbing floors, was a grey, overcast afternoon. He loaded boxes into the back of a car that was no longer a Bentley. His face was drawn. His suit was wrinkled. He paused on the front steps and looked up at the house, and something crossed his features that might, in another man, have been remorse. Serafina watched from the upstairs window, Margot asleep in her arms. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel victorious. She felt tired and free, and for the first time in years she felt like herself. She turned away from the window and walked through the house, her house, trailing her fingers along the walls, through the hallway, past the nursery, down the staircase where she had once descended like a ghost. She walked into the living room and saw, in the corner, a box that the movers had missed. Inside it, wrapped in tissue paper, was her grandmother's armoire. The one Maxim had banished to storage because it didn't match the aesthetic. Serafina called the staff. She asked them to bring it back, and they placed it in the living room, right in the center, where it stood like a monument to everything Lenora Morel had built, and everything Serafina had reclaimed. In the months that followed, Serafina rebuilt, not the marriage that was ashes, but herself. She went back to nursing, part-time at first, then full-time. She enrolled in a program to become a nurse practitioner. She established a foundation in her grandmother's name, the Lenora Morel Foundation, that provided financial literacy education and housing assistance to immigrant women. She sat on the board meetings in the same rooms where Gertrude Kessler had once dismissed her, and she spoke with a voice that no longer trembled. Nadia became Margot's godmother. She moved into the guest house on the property. the one that was bigger than any home Serafina had ever lived in before her marriage, and filled it with loud music and laughter and the kind of chaotic love that children thrive on. Margot adored her. She called her Auntie Nana and toddled after her through the gardens with her arms outstretched. Dr. Farouk continued to be Serafina's doctor. At a routine checkup, months after the divorce, she said, "You look different, Serafina, lighter." And Serafina smiled and said, "I feel lighter." Maxim, meanwhile, imploded. The board of Kessler Holdings voted to remove him from his position. Tobias Crane restructured the company, dropping Maxim's name from the building. The properties Gertrude had hidden were discovered and seized. The social circle that had once orbited Maxim like planets around a sun moved on, finding new hosts, new parties, new people to admire. He rented an apartment downtown, a nice one, but nothing compared to the mansion, and spent his evenings in a silence he had never learned to tolerate. Gertrude stopped visiting, not because she had developed a conscience, but because visiting meant acknowledging that her son had failed. And Gertrude Kessler did not acknowledge failure. She moved to a condo in the south and communicated only through her attorneys. One night, almost a year after the divorce, Maxim drove past the mansion. He didn't plan to. He was on his way somewhere else. But the road curved, and there it was, lit up, warm, alive. He slowed the car. Through the windows, he could see the living room. He could see Serafina sitting on the floor with Margot in her lap, reading a picture book. He could see Nadia in the kitchen, dancing to something he couldn't hear. He could see the armoire standing in the corner, solid and weathered and enduring. He sat in his parked car for 20 minutes, watching the life that was happening inside the house that was no longer his, and for the first time, not the performed contrition he had displayed for lawyers, not the strategic regret he had offered to the press. For the first time, Maxim Kessler felt genuine, crushing, inescapable remorse, not because he had lost the house, not because he had lost the company, because he had lost her, because he had slapped the hand that had once touched his wound with the steadiest hands he had ever seen, because he had broken something that could not be repaired. He thought about calling her. He picked up his phone 3 times. Each time he stared at her name in his contacts and tried to compose a message, and found that every word he typed was inadequate. "I'm sorry, too small. I was wrong, too late. I miss you, too selfish." Because even now, even in the depths of his regret, some part of Maxim Kessler was thinking about himself, about what he had lost, about how he felt. And that was the core of who he was. A man so thoroughly trapped inside his own perspective that even his remorse was a form of narcissism. He would never fully understand what he had done to Serafina, not because the damage was invisible, but because understanding it would require him to see her as a complete human being, not as a wife, not as a mother, not as a reflection of himself, but as a person with her own gravity and her own light, and Maxim had never learned how to see anyone that way. He drove away. The road was dark and empty, and his headlights carved a narrow path through the night, and behind him, the mansion grew smaller in the rearview mirror, until it was just a point of light, and then nothing at all. Serafina never knew he had been there. She finished reading the picture book. She kissed Margot's forehead. She carried her daughter up the staircase, the same staircase, but different now, because the woman climbing it was different, and she tucked her into the crib that she had built with her own hands in the nursery painted sage green. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her daughter sleep, and then she whispered, in the quiet of that room, in the house that her grandmother had given her, on the ground that her grandmother had claimed, the words that Lenora had told her every single night. "The world will try to make you small, mon cœur, but you were born to take up space." She turned off the light. She closed the door softly, and she walked through the hallway of her home, truly, legally, irrevocably her home, with her head held high and her shoulders straight, and the knowledge that she had been standing on solid ground all along. She just hadn't known it yet. And that right there is the thing about women like Serafina, about women like Lenora, about women who have been told their entire lives that they are small, that they are less, that they don't belong in the rooms they're standing in. The world underestimates them. It dismisses them. It looks right through them. And then one day, it discovers that the ground beneath its feet never belonged to it at all. It belonged to her. It always had. Some stories end with a bang. A courtroom explosion, a public humiliation, a villain dragged away in handcuffs. But the most powerful endings are quieter than that. They're the ones where a woman tucks her daughter into bed in a house that is hers and whispers words of strength into the dark and knows, with a certainty that no court order or bank account or powerful man can shake, that she is enough, that she has always been enough. Serafina Morel was enough. And Maxim Kessler learned it far too late. 2 years later, the Lenora Morel Foundation held its first annual gala. It was held at the mansion, the same room where Maxim's birthday party had taken place, the same room where the slap had echoed. But it looked different now. The champagne tower was gone, the gold leaf cake was gone. In their place were tables decked with simple white linens, centerpieces of wildflowers, and programs printed with Lenora's photograph on the cover. A young woman with fierce eyes and a baby on her hip, standing in front of a small house she had just purchased with money she had earned on her hands and knees. Serafina stood at the podium and addressed a room full of women. Some were immigrants, some were survivors of abuse, some were both. She didn't tell them about the legal victory, or the land, or the divorce. She told them about her grandmother, about the $11, about the letter, about the words. The world will try to make you small, but you were born to take up space. And when she finished, the room didn't just applaud. They stood. Every single person in that room rose to their feet, and Serafina stood at the podium with tears streaming down her face. And she felt Lenora beside her, not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as a presence, warm and steady and eternal, the way only grandmothers can be. Margot, 2 years old now, sat on Nadia's lap in the front row, clapping her tiny hands together without understanding why, but knowing, the way children know things, that something important was happening, something that began long before she was born and would continue long after. A legacy, not of money or land or legal victories, but of strength, of resilience, of the stubborn, beautiful, unbreakable insistence on taking up space in a world that tried to make you small. If this story moved you, if you felt something in your chest during those moments, the slap, the letter, the lawyer's words, then hold on to that feeling. Because there are Serafinas everywhere, in hospitals and kitchens and offices and homes where no one sees what's happening behind closed doors, and sometimes all they need is what Lenora built in silence, a foundation strong enough to stand on when everything else falls away. The ground is there. It has always been there. You just have to know it's yours.